G'day guys, welcome back to True Footy and Just the Tips for round 6 of the 2025 AFL season. We're starting to get a good feel for teams. There's a good body of work there now where we can genuinely get a feel for who's going to be good and who's not this year. Although there are a few exceptions, like what the hell do we make of Port Adelaide right now? I myself got 7 correct tips out of 9 last week. The 2 Adelaide related games, well they're all Adelaide related games, but the 2 games involving the Crows and the Power, the 2 I got wrong. I got Adelaide to beat Geelong. I got that wrong, with the Cats prevailing in a really good win for their season, considering the form of the Crows, of course. And then that final game between Port and Hawthorn was probably even more bizarre and harder to explain than when Port Adelaide's flogged Sydney last year. It's funny how the Power were involved in both of those games. To be leading 79-8 against the previously undefeated team in Hawthorn. Unbelievable stuff. So again, they're a hard team to read, but we'll get into round 6 very shortly. Before we do, I will shout out the winners of our competitions on the True Footy YouTube channel. We had Dylan Selvage getting the best round of tipping with 9 correct tips and a margin of 11. Well done, Dylan. And the Mad Hueys regains top spot with 37 correct tips and 114 as a cumulative margin. And our leader in the fantasy competition is a new name, Daniel Bale, with an average of 19.23. So well done to all 3 of you gentlemen, I'm going to assume. And remember, if you want to take part in these competitions, guys, the links are still in the description of all of these tipping videos. Now we're into round 6, and I said this a couple of weeks ago, that it was a really tough round of tipping. Last week wasn't too bad, got it 7. This week, maybe the hardest, the highest concentration of 50-50 games that I have seen this year so far, which, sort of goes against what I said. We're starting to get a good feel for teams. Well, now we're faced with a round where a lot of similarly ranked teams, in my opinion, are playing each other. And there's a few quirky ones, and I'm probably going to throw a few quirky tips out there. But let's start with Brisbane versus Collingwood at the Gabba. Now, this was obviously a grand final replay of 2023, where the Lions fell short by 4 points that day. I nearly said they won, but they didn't. They won the year after. And interestingly as well, up to that point, Brisbane have won a lot of, was it like 7 in a row against Collingwood? So there is some form in that respect. Last week, Brisbane put in yet another performance where they were good enough, but not good throughout the entire game. That has been a common thread for the Brisbane Lions so far this year. Talking about how they got 5 or 6 goals down against the Western Bulldogs and came back in heroic fashion and won. I think that was a really good win. Against West Coast, they started slow. Against the Cats, they were 5 goals down. Against Richmond, they probably faded late, although they were never really in doubt to win that, to be honest. But overall, Brisbane seems to be doing enough, but not quite being convincing enough in their wins for me to be confident about this game. But that's what the good teams do. They don't necessarily need to be smashing every team out of the park. They're just accumulating the wins, which is something they failed to do in the first 7 rounds last year, obviously. Not that it mattered. So they played Collingwood. Collingwood has been a very good team and now sit higher than Hawthorn on the ladder, with Hawthorn's fairly big loss to the Power last week. They're coming off a good win against Sydney. I got that tip correct, but I really didn't know how that game was going to go, and I think we learned a lot. The Pies are backed in some really good form and sitting in the top 4. So I think on form, to be honest, there's not much separating these two sides. The Pies did have that opening round loss to the Giants, but since then have looked pretty good. They have a win over the Bulldogs, have beaten Carlton, and of course beating Sydney last week. I was surprised to see on the ESPN app, only 15% of people are tipping Collingwood. Now in my app, I actually did tip Collingwood before starting this video, but there is some really strong head-to-head form between these two sides where the Brisbane Lions generally win, except for that fateful grand final, of course. But I do kind of take that into account. Well, if you've been watching this series for a while, you know I do take in the head-to-head quite a lot and how teams play at ground, as much good as that actually does me. With that all being said, I think I will actually tip the Brisbane Lions here. I thought I was going to tip Collingwood, but I will say the Lions continue their good form. I'm not super convinced, though. I think the Lions have just been getting by playing good enough for long enough, but they have looked vulnerable at patches this year, so that's why I'm iffy. So I'll say the Lions by 12 points, but I don't know if I like it. North Melbourne versus Carlton, the first of the 2 Good Friday games. This is, again, iffy, and I'm torn here because my first reaction is, North could win this. And then I think back to 2 weeks ago where I tipped North to beat Sydney, and I said that was one of the worst tips I've ever done. Somebody in the comments actually pointed out I tipped Sydney to beat Port and they lost by 112. So that probably is my worst tip ever. Although nobody really saw that result coming, whereas North beating Sydney was a very unlikely result given what everyone else thought. Anyway, North Melbourne were pretty good last week. The Gold Coast Suns are the real deal in my opinion. I'm not going to say that we're going to win the premiership or anything like that, but the football, the brand of football they're playing right now is very compelling, and they sit second on the ladder as it currently stands, having played one less game, of course. And the North really took it up to them for 3 quarters. Of course, the margin blew out a little bit towards the end, but I don't think that is something I'll mark too heavily against North. Now, they're still a very young side, so I just don't know how consistent they're going to be. Their best football is good enough to beat Carlton, who, for the most part, have been sloppy this year. At 0-4, I never really thought they were truly, a bottom 4 side or anything like that, but they certainly were a long way off their best footy for a side that is stacked with absolute talent. I don't really know how much there is to take out of their big win over West Coast. It was very one-sided. Very mature team against a very young team that is obviously playing some horrendous footy at the moment. And look, Carlton were fairly good, but, they were also a little bit patchy, which doesn't mean that they're going to be poor in this game. But I would say that Carlton need to put in their best performance of the year to win this game. That's fair to suggest. Could they do it? Last time they met, North took it up to them. It was in that late season form when North started to be a bit more competitive. I think North are a chance here, to be honest, but I wonder if Carlton will have some confidence, having had a win, at least a morale boost. I don't think there's much to be made of their win over West Coast, but really from a mindset point of view, I really want to tip North again. I really do. I feel like there is a chance North will be one of those teams that will catch teams napping this year. And the last time I showed faith, they got well beaten by Sydney. But I think I'm going to tip North by 4 points, and I'm probably going to live to regret this again. Finally a game that does not require much analysis. West Coast versus Essendon, Good Friday at Optus Stadium. I'm just hoping this is a good game, to be honest, because obviously as a West Coast fan, it's been tough going. 0-5 with a percentage of less than 50%. And the most recent loss against Carlton was probably the least competitive West Coast have been. It's not the biggest loss, but in terms of how the actual game played out, there weren't too many signs of life against the Carlton side that had been out of form to that point. So at home with, it's been a big week for West Coast in terms of, media criticism has been pretty constant, but it seems to be pretty palpable at the moment coming off that loss. And sometimes that has sparked West Coast into playing well. But West Coast playing well at the moment is probably still not going to be enough to win this game. So Essendon have just beaten Melbourne by 39 points. That was a bigger win than I expected. I did tip the Dons, but Melbourne, I don't really know what to make of them at the moment. I don't really have a good explanation for why they're 0-5 and just barely ahead of West Coast, because the quality on that team, well, they're not doing it justice at the moment, in my opinion. It goes deeper than purely talent. But Essendon have actually been all right this year, to be honest. They're 90%. 2 wins, 2 losses. Those 2 wins were against a very poor Melbourne side and a Port Adelaide side that was pretty poor, or at least on that night, and then subsequently have smashed Hawthorn. I don't really know how much to read into the form lines. Either way, I'm probably overanalyzing this game because I think we know how this is going to go. The form that Essendon has shown has clearly been to a much higher standard than what we've seen from West Coast, who are clearly worse than Melbourne at the moment. Is there a chance that West Coast pings a surprise? I think there's a chance that West Coast gets a surprising lead, but I am not confident enough to tip West Coast. Of course, this is probably West Coast's most winnable game on paper for this year so far, but I'm going to say they still fall short, as much as I love them. And I'm praying I'm wrong, but Essendon by 42 points. Melbourne and Fremantle at the MCG. We did just discuss Melbourne a little bit there. I don't have really too much insight as to why they're so low on the ladder right now. It's not just their ladder position, well, it's their percentage as well, but also just the listlessness of the performances we've seen. And to come up in a fairly winnable game against Essendon, who are not expected to play finals this year, they were a fair way off. And there seems to be some genuine disconnect, as we've talked about on this channel throughout the week. So I don't have a lot of faith in them. I think there's still obviously really good talent there, but 5 pretty poor performances from the D's, save for maybe their round 1 performance against the Giants where they nearly won the game. Since then, they've been in a bit of a free fall, and they're coming up against a Fremantle side that is starting to find their groove. Now, in the last 3 weeks, Fremantle have won 3. They've beaten Richmond and West Coast admittedly, but even their performance against the Western Bulldogs, well, that in particular was a sign that they've started to regain some confidence. Josh Tracy's in outstanding form. He's an absolute gun and could lay claim to being their best player at the moment. And I just don't think Melbourne's going to have the answers for him, let alone, Fremantle's dominant midfield. And the fact that historically Melbourne have a real clear recent history of getting pantsed by Fremantle. So I think Fremantle could win this by as many as 55 points. Now we're getting into a real doozy territory. Adelaide and GWS is incredibly hard to predict. The Crows have been mostly good this year, and even in the 2 losses, they sit 3-2, which feels underwhelming compared to how well they look to have played this year. Their 2 losses have been against the Gold Coast Suns and Geelong. They got run over the top, particularly when Dangerfield went forward in that game. I think Adelaide's defensive structure just struggled to find a good matchup for Danger. And that is normal, but that is their vulnerability. And they continue to concede pretty high scores. Against the Suns, I think they conceded 91. They've conceded 100 quite a few times this year, including against Geelong. So we're seeing that shootout style football from the Crows so far this year, but they've still played well, and I wouldn't say that they've been unconvincing in any of their performances so far. But they do come up against the Giants, who are a very strong outfit with 4 wins and the 1 loss. That 1 loss being against Hawthorn in Tasmania, and last week being too good for a pretty plucky St Kilda side who Adelaide, fairly comfortably beat. So look, there's the travel factor. Well, actually, there isn't. There's no travel factor as such, other than the fact that it's an Adelaide home game. I presume GWS stayed in Adelaide for this week. On talent, this is a really tough game. And look, the Giants, on paper, are one of the strongest teams in the competition, and I think have played their brand of footy for the most part this year. They've had big wins over Collingwood and against West Coast, another big win and another very tough opponent there. But we just saw that slingshot, end-to-end ball movement, orange tsunami, whatever superlatives you want to use. That's in full force. They've got some great smalls and really strong talls front and back. So this is a really big test for the Crows. They'll be disappointed, naturally, to have fallen short in a game that I was pretty confident they were going to win against the Cats. So that game was a bit of a dress rehearsal. Another contender at home at Adelaide Oval. I still don't know who I'm going to tip here. I looked at the head-to-head. 2023, the Giants beat Adelaide, but in 2024, the Crows beat the Giants. They're the last 2 games at Adelaide Oval. As far as form lines go, funnily enough, Adelaide was better in 2023. So, I don't know how much I learned there. Matt, look, I'm going to tip the home side here. I'm going to say the Crows win this. They make up for last week. Disappointing loss. They'll get the job done this week. Richmond versus Gold Coast at Marvel Stadium. Look, Richmond have actually been fairly plucky and competitive this year. The final scoreline against Fremantle doesn't represent that, but obviously they have a win under their belts. A couple of bad losses, but then I thought against the Brisbane Lions and then against Fremantle, in particular, maybe 2.5 quarters. Richmond was maybe not matching them, but staying in the contest, and I think they have a pretty good balance of young and old across the field. I can't help but compare them to West Coast, who have no midfielders at all. Richmond are a fair bit more competitive than that. But coming up against the Suns, who we've talked about, were too good for a very gallant North Melbourne last week, and their class just overcame North Melbourne, particularly in that final quarter. And to me, I think they're the real deal. So I don't really think there's too much to say about this game. Gold Coast are one of the most well-equipped side. I think against West Coast in round 1, I heard they had 17 first-round picks playing that team. I don't know if that number has fluctuated much. But Richmond are on the opposite end of the spectrum now, and the Gold Coast Suns should win this by, I'll go 35 points. It won't be 87 points like West Coast lost by. Sydney and Port Adelaide, oh man. Like I said, Port Adelaide have thrown a spanner in the works with their recent form. I was pretty ready to write them off, and I was probably wrong for that. I guess we still don't know the answer to that, but I really didn't see their big win over Hawthorn coming, and I'm sure few did, let alone the margin they got out to. So look, the talent from a Port Adelaide point of view is hard to argue with. They have a very strong midfield in particular, and Jason Horne-Francis has had a great start to this season, no doubt. Zach Butters is also back in the team. Now, Sydney sit 2-3, and I think they've played better football than that would suggest. I think up to this point, Sydney have played the better football than Port Adelaide. Save for Port Adelaide's really good last week win. The Swans got done by Collingwood last week, but I didn't think they played too badly. So there's obviously injuries on Sydney's side, but there's still a lot of talent in that team. And at home, well, I mean, in the prelims, Sydney beat them fairly easily, but generally speaking, I think Port Adelaide's won like 10 of the last 12 against Sydney. I could be plucking that, but there was a long period of dominance of Port Adelaide winning far more than they lost against Sydney up until the prelim final. Do Port Adelaide back up that performance? I mean, how do you reconcile their away loss to Essendon, where they were particularly poor, with their most recent win over Hawthorn, let alone some of their other disappointing performances? Do they have a full head of steam right now? Could they roll Sydney? I think they could. Am I going to bet on that? Maybe? Oh, I think I'm going to go safe here. I think Sydney... Oh my God. The variable here is Port Adelaide. I don't know which version of them is going to show up to this game, and their form at this ground is also fairly decent. So I'm going to say Sydney. I'm just going to bank on the fact that they beat them in the prelim, and albeit they have some injuries, I think they'll be too good. But I'll say it's like 6 it is. And yet another 50-50 between two sides that have played some decent footy this year, albeit have fallen short a few times. So the Bulldogs, last week, they got 5 goals up against the Brisbane Lions and looked really good. And they've coped really well without some key players this year. I've been impressed with them, even in some of their losses. I think back to the Collingwood performance, I thought they were quite good that night. They are continuing this trend of being hard to predict, the Western Bulldogs. They were the same last year. By the end of last year, they were one of the better form sides of the competition. And that was an intriguing elimination final when they took on Hawthorn. And then they ultimately fell short and got eliminated in week 1. So we're just seeing a little bit more of this Jekyll and Hyde version of the Western Bulldogs. I suppose I give them some grace considering they've been missing some really important plays in that team. Nonetheless, the product without, those guys is still pretty good. And St Kilda have been impressive this year for the most part. Again, the Giants sort of ran away from them last week. That is a pretty stern test. And their other loss was against the Crows in Adelaide. Other than that, I think they had a big win over Richmond, and in particular that win over Geelong, who I would rate as a more difficult opponent than the Western Bulldogs here. So on form, I'd actually go as far as to say St Kilda have been better. This is at Marvel Stadium, and gee whiz. I have not clearly deciphered who is better out of these two teams yet, so this game is giving me some angst. I think on the basis that St Kilda have been better, I think I'm going to back them in. I think I've undersold St Kilda enough this year. I don't think I've incorrectly tipped them to win yet. This might be the first week. I'm going to say St Kilda win by 14 points. Oh, and if you thought the difficult tips were over, welcome to this one. Easter Monday. This will be an outstanding clash, I hope, and I presume. The Cats, great win over the Crows in the opening game of Gather Round, and a really impressive performance. That move forward of Dangerfield was a masterstroke. And look, they have been fairly inconsistent this year, and it's been a pretty whirlwind 5 games. They've lost 2 games, they've won 3, they've lost to the Saints, and they lost to the Lions at the Gabba. So that's part of that inconsistency, is mid-game they got run over the top of. But last week, they looked fantastic, I thought. It was a really potentially season-defining win to go to Adelaide Oval, beat the Crows, where I think that's going to be a tough place to win games this year for any team. Hawthorn had a real speed hump last week. They crashed into a hurdle that probably not many saw coming. Albeit Port Adelaide do actually have a good recent history of wins over Hawthorn now. That's at least 3 in a row. Maybe it goes back longer, but since Hawthorn have been good, that's 3 in a row that Port Adelaide have won. So maybe I probably should have seen that coming a little bit more, but look, the form line of Hawthorn going into that game was very strong. It's just we've seen one pretty diabolical first half from Hawthorn, and they, to their credit, they cut the margin back to 5 goals. So, strange game. Do we ignore it? Well, we know that Will Day is also out, and he is an absolute prime mover, to say the least, for the Hawthorn Footy Club. Are they going to be good enough to beat Geelong? This is really tough. This is going to be a pretty informative Easter Monday clash. How much do Hawthorn rely on Will Day? I don't think massively, but it could absolutely be the deciding variable in a game between two sides here that are very strong. I think, with that all being said, I'm going to tip Geelong. And I'm going to tip them by 8 points, and that will give them some further legitimacy. So as we look at the ladder, the 2 Queensland sides are still top 2. The Giants in 3rd and the Cats sneaking into 4th. I'm backing in the Crows to move into 5th spot with a win. Fremantle in the 6th, and Hawthorn down to 8th, which would have been difficult to predict a couple of weeks ago. I thought Hawthorn, you would expect them to probably stay in that top 2 prior to the Port Adelaide game. Down the bottom of the ladder, that's starting to take shape with Richmond, Melbourne and West Coast probably clearly the bottom 3 this year. Not sure if North Melbourne will be in that bottom 4. This might actually be a big win for North's season in terms of deciding where they finish. Where is Carlton at? Carlton's talent far exceeds a bottom 4 finish. I don't expect them to stay there, but it would be helpful to North season if they win that game. The Bulldogs in 13th feels rough, but I suppose they just haven't won the games, and I didn't tip them this week. St Kilda in 9th, Sydney in 10th. I'm jumping all over the place here, but we are starting to see something closer to how we rate these teams in that ladder order. So let me know in the comments, guys, what do you think of my tips for a start? Let me know your game of the round. Oh, you could pick any of them. I'm going to go with the Easter Monday clash. I know that's basic, but Adelaide and GWS will also be a really scintillating battle. Sydney and Port has some potential too, so there's too many to pick from. Upset of the round, do I dare say West Coast? Nope. I will say North Melbourne because that's who I tip. So let me know in the comments what you guys think. I'll see you in the next one.